Hello viewers, welcome to my YouTube channel. Get ready for heart-touching stories. Don't forget to subscribe and let's begin.
The day my grandfather moved into our house, my mother rearranged the living room furniture to make space for his hospital-grade recliner. She hung wind chimes on the back porch because he'd always loved the sound of them, and she cooked his favorite meal, chicken and dumplings with extra black pepper, to welcome him home. That was the version of my mother I believed in for a long time. My name is Daniel Whitmore, and I'm 31 years old. What I'm about to tell you is the story of the 2 years I spent watching my family slowly become strangers to me, and the single afternoon in a lawyer's office that changed everything I thought I knew about my grandfather, my parents, and myself. Grandpa Emmett had lived alone in his farmhouse in rural Tennessee for 11 years after my grandmother passed. He was stubborn about it, fiercely, almost poetically stubborn. He grew tomatoes in the summer, and kept a wood-burning stove that he insisted on feeding himself even when his knees started failing him. He drove his truck to church every Sunday and to the hardware store on Thursdays, and he called me every Saturday morning at 9 o'clock sharp, no matter what. I was his only grandchild. My parents, Robert and Linda Whitmore, had one son, me, and they'd spent most of my childhood building a respectable but unremarkable life in the Nashville suburbs. My father sold commercial insurance. My mother managed the front office of a dental practice. They were comfortable, not wealthy, and they had a talent for appearing generous while carefully calculating the cost of everything. When Grandpa Emmett turned 82 and his doctor flagged early-stage dementia, the family conversation began. I was living in Denver at the time, working in landscape architecture. I flew home for Thanksgiving that year, and over turkey and sweet potato casserole my father laid out what he called the plan. Your grandfather has substantial assets, my father said, choosing his words the way a man chooses a parking space, deliberately with an eye for advantage. The farmhouse alone is worth close to 400,000. His investment accounts are healthy, he's not a poor man. He's also your father, I said, which is why we want to take care of him properly. My mother smiled and reached across the table to pat my hand. We've spoken with his attorney. If your grandfather agrees to sell the farmhouse and move in with us, and if we formally take over his care, we'd receive a caregiving disbursement from his estate. It's actually quite common. It compensates the family for lost income and time. Much, I asked, to pause. 1.2 million, my father said, paid out over 2 years with the remainder held in trust. I stared at my plate. The wind chimes on the porch shifted in the November breeze. Grandpa Emmett was in the living room watching the game, unaware that his life was being organized around a financial instrument. Does he know about the disbursement? I asked. It was his suggestion, my mother said briskly. His attorney drew it up. Emmett wanted to make sure we were properly compensated. I told myself this was fine. Grandpa Emmett was sharp enough then to make his own decisions. He'd always been practical about money. He grew up in a family that lost everything in a flood and rebuilt from nothing. Of course he would put a contract around something as important as his final years. Of course, I flew back to Denver telling myself this was fine. Grandpa moved into my parents' house in February. They'd converted the downstairs guest room for him, a nice room, southern-facing, with good light. He brought his recliner and his wind chimes and a framed photograph of my grandmother on their wedding day. For the first few months, my mother called every week with updates that made everything sound warm and well-managed. Grandpa was doing his physical therapy. Grandpa had joined a senior card group at the community center. Grandpa was eating well. I visited in June. The wind chimes weren't on the porch. They were in a box in the garage, next to a neat stack of Grandpa's woodworking tools. The recliner had been moved to a corner of his room, wedged between the wall and a tall dresser in a way that made it hard to reach without assistance. Grandpa's room was tidy, almost aggressively so, the way rooms look when someone visits infrequently and things are arranged for display rather than living. Grandpa himself looked smaller. Not physically, he still had the broad shoulders of a man who'd baled hay well into his 60s, but smaller in the way a tree looks wrong when you put it in a pot too tight for its roots. She unplugged my radio, he told me quietly when my mother was in the kitchen. Says it disturbs the house in the mornings. I used to listen to the farm report. He glanced toward the door and dropped his voice further. I get up at 5, same as always. But there's nothing to do and nowhere to go, so I just sit. You talk to Dad about it? He looked at me with the patient eyes of a man who had spent 8 decades learning exactly how much honesty a situation could bear. Your father's a good man who loves a comfortable life, he said, and I make his life less comfortable. We both know that. I confronted my parents that evening. My mother explained that the radio was too loud and the neighbors were close. My father said Grandpa had settled in beautifully and that the adjustment period was normal. They were kind and reasonable and utterly immovable, and I went back to Denver feeling like I'd failed him. Over the following year, the erosion was gradual and systematic. The card group stopped because my mother said the driving was too much trouble. Grandpa's weekly calls to me became harder. He'd lose his train of thought, search for words, sometimes fall into a confused silence that frightened me with its depth. His physician had warned us that stimulation and social engagement were critical for slowing the dementia's progression. My parents provided what I can only describe as managed isolation. Safe, clean, fed, and utterly without purpose. By the second winter, Grandpa Emmett barely left his room. I moved back to Nashville in January, ostensibly for a job opportunity, but truthfully because the Saturday calls had started to sound like a man slowly disappearing, and I couldn't listen from 2,000 miles away anymore. I took an apartment 20 minutes from my parents' house and began visiting Grandpa 3 times a week. My parents were not pleased, though they were too polished to say so outright. Disrupting his routine, my mother told me once. He doesn't have a routine, I said. He has a schedule, there's a difference. I started taking him out. Small things at first: drives in the country, stops at the hardware store, coffee at the diner he'd liked in his old neighborhood. His eyes would change during these trips, sharpen at the edges. The way a room looks different when you open the curtains. He'd talk about the farm, about my grandmother, about a dog he'd had as a boy named Copper who could predict rain. A good kid, Danny, he told me one afternoon, using the name he'd called me since I was 4. Always been the one with your eyes open. I didn't know then what he meant. Grandpa Emmett died on a Thursday in March, 2 weeks after his 84th birthday. He passed in his sleep quietly in the small room with the good southern light. The hospice nurse said it was peaceful. I choose to believe her. My parents handled everything efficiently. The funeral was well attended. Grandpa had been respected in his community for 60 years, and the eulogies were warm, and my mother cried beautifully. I sat in the front pew and held my grandfather's memory the way you hold something you know you won't be able to keep. 3 weeks after the funeral, we were called to the office of a man named Gerald Fitch, Grandpa Emmett's attorney, for the reading of the will. I expected grief resolution, the mechanical business of conclusion. I was not prepared for what actually happened. Gerald Fitch was a compact, unhurried man in his late 60s who wore bifocals on a chain, and had the manner of someone who had delivered many surprises in his long career, and felt no particular need to rush toward the next one. He offered us coffee. My parents declined. I accepted. He began with the standard inventory: property, accounts, personal effects. The farmhouse had been sold when Grandpa moved in with my parents. Those proceeds had already been distributed as part of the caregiving disbursement along with the investment accounts. My parents had received their $1.2 million, structured and documented, with all appropriate legal formality. However, Mr. Fitch said, removing his glasses and setting them on the desk, your father made significant amendments to his estate plan approximately 14 months ago. My mother's posture changed almost imperceptibly, the way a house settles in the moment before a crack appears. In his amended will, Emmett Whitmore states the following. Mr. Fitch lifted the document. He describes in his own words a period of observation. He notes specific dates and incidents. He is quite detailed. A pause. He was a precise man. My father cleared his throat. Gerald, I'm sure whatever. He documents the removal of items meaningful to him. He documents the termination of outside social activities. He documents, and I want to be careful here because these are his words, not mine, a caregiving arrangement that met every financial specification and failed every human one. Room was very quiet. Emmett maintained a private journal, which he gave to my keeping 14 months ago along with the amended documents. He asked that I read from it directly, so that nothing would be lost in summary. Mr. Fitch looked at my parents over the desk with the calm of a man who had been asked to do this by someone he respected and intended to honor that request fully. He read for 11 minutes. My grandfather's voice came through every sentence, careful, plain-spoken, and devastating. He wrote about the wind chimes in the garage. He wrote about the radio. He wrote about sitting in the dark at 5 in the morning with nothing to hear and nowhere to go. He wrote about the card group and the drives and the slow, efficient removal of every small thing that had made him feel like a person rather than a problem being managed. He also wrote about me. He wrote about the drives and the hardware store and the diner. He wrote about the Saturday calls and what they'd meant to him across 30 years. He wrote in a passage that I will carry in my chest for the rest of my life. Daniel never needed a contract to love me. That always told me everything I needed to know about his character and about what I owed him. My parents sat perfectly still. Amended will, Mr. Fitch continued, replacing the journal gently on the desk, allocates the residual estate as follows. The caregiving disbursement to Robert and Linda Whitmore stands. Those funds were disbursed under valid legal agreement and are not recovered. However, Emmett had one additional asset that was not part of the original disbursement structure. He slid a document across the desk. It was a life insurance policy, taken out 30 years ago, maintained quietly and separately from everything else, never mentioned and never disclosed to my parents during the estate planning conversations. The beneficiary had been my grandmother. Upon her death, Emmett had amended the beneficiary designation to remain in trust, payable upon his own death. The value was $480,000, payable in full to Daniel James Whitmore. My mother made a sound like a door closing. There is also a letter, Mr. Fitch said, sliding an envelope toward me, cream-colored, sealed with the kind of deliberate pressure that says I meant this. He asked that you read it privately. I read the letter in my car in the parking garage, because I could not make myself wait. It was 3 pages in my grandfather's handwriting, which had got looser in the last year but was still unmistakably his, the wide capital E's. The way his sevens had a crossbar like the European style he'd picked up from a German neighbor as a boy. He told me about the insurance policy, how he'd kept it separate because he'd learned young that money changes how people treat information. He told me he'd watched carefully during his time in my parents' house, that he'd understood what was happening and had made his peace with it, because men who grow up hard learn to accept the truth of things without letting it destroy them. He told me to use the money for something that grew. Land, he suggested, or education, or a business built on something real. Don't let it sit, he wrote. Money is a seed, not a harvest. He told me about my grandmother and the early years of the farm and the flood that took his family's land when he was 9. He told me about rebuilding, and at the end, in the last paragraph, he wrote, I'm not angry at your parents, Danny. People who need a contract to love someone are just people who are afraid. Fear makes us smaller than we are. You were never afraid of me, not when I was strong and not when I wasn't. That's a rare thing, don't waste it. My parents and I don't speak much now. Not from bitterness on my part. Grandpa specifically asked me not to carry it that way, but because some distances, once understood clearly, simply remain. I bought a piece of land outside the city. 5 acres, a creek along the south edge, good soil. I'm learning to grow things, sometimes in the early mornings, when it's still dark and the air is doing that thing it does before sunrise, where everything smells like it's considering what to become. I think about my grandfather sitting in a room full of good light with the wind chimes in a box and the radio unplugged. And then I think about the drives and the hardware store and the way his eyes sharpened at the edges. He saw everything clearly right to the end. And at the end, quietly and precisely and with the patience of a man who had rebuilt things before, he made sure it mattered. That was Emmett Whitmore. That was my grandfather. For anyone who has an elder in their life who is slowly going quiet, go visit them, take them somewhere. Let them tell you about the dog they had as a boy. You may not know yet what that means to them, but they know.